sitting on my doorstep, the people's passing by. They're coming back from getting wrecked. Everybody's high. Saturday night, what a bitch, laying on the lawn. The morning comes to bring the switch after the buzz is gone.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Addictions, the podcast about addictions. I'm your host, David Wagner. On this episode of Addictions, we speak with recovering alcoholic and now author Larry Ruhl. That's R-U-H-L. Larry recently published a memoir which chronicles his experience of mental and sexual abuse from his parents while he was a very young child. The book is titled Breaking All the Rules, with the word rules spelled just like Larry's last name, R-U-H-L-S. The book does a phenomenal job of exploring the reality of child sexual abuse under which many victims and survivors alike often stay silent about for fear of harsh judgment by society. Larry went on to abuse alcohol as a way to escape his terrible past and the memories therein. Larry touches on many subjects in the book like shame, PTSD, abuse, addiction, and recovery, and I am absolutely honored to have had the chance to record an interview with him. Before we get to my interview with Larry, I just want to remind everyone that you can find all of our episodes on our website at www.addictionspodcast.wordpress.com, as well as all of the normal places that you find podcasts like iTunes, Spotify, and Google Play. And if you really love the show and want to help support what I am doing, you can also make one-time donations now by visiting www.paypal.me/theaddictionspodcast. You can also find the donation link on our WordPress website. And if you want to make a monthly contribution, visit www.patreon.com/addictions. That's patreon.com/addictions. If you are interested in checking out Larry's book, visit his website at breakingtheruhls.com. Again, that's rules spelled just like Larry's last name, R-U-H-L-S. Enough of my crap, though. Let's get to the interview. Welcome to the Addictions Podcast. Today our guest is Larry Ruhl, author of Breaking All the Rules, which you can find on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, pretty much wherever you're going to find books, you can find a copy of it. And I urge all of our listeners to be sure and go out and check that out because it's a real page turner. I couldn't put it down. Larry, I want to thank you for coming on the show, first of all.
Thank you so much for having me.
You know, it means a lot.
Appreciate it.
It means a lot to me to have a guest like you. First off, what was it that made you want to write Breaking All the Rules? What was it that made you want to put this out there?
Well, it was sort of, it happened in stages. You know, I used some writing as a therapeutic exercise to start to deal with some day-to-day triggers that I was still experiencing, and decided to write out exactly what my father had done to me when I was a kid. But then, as I was writing, I really got thrown, and I put the writing down for 6 months because I was not convinced that I wouldn't pick up a drink over writing. So I put it to bed and then revisited it about 6 months later. And, you know, I don't know. I felt compelled to tell my story and to share it in the hopes that some other survivors might not feel as alone as I did back when I was going through the worst of it.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a pretty damn good reason for writing it.
Yeah.
Now, for listeners who don't know exactly, you want to briefly touch on what you went through during your childhood?
Sure. I was my household growing up was really volatile. I had two parents. My mother suffered mental illness that was undiagnosed until much, much later in life, but she had borderline personality disorder and was just never reliable in terms of her outbursts and her rage towards my father. And my father started sexually abusing me before I even started kindergarten. So by the time I was, four, some of the worst things had already happened to me.
Yeah. Well, the borderline personality disorder is It's really difficult to deal with. I
Yes.
myself, I've known several people to have it. You love these people so much, but yet they do things to push you away, and then they do things to bring you back in really close, and it's just this back and forth
Yes.
thing. It's really unreal.
Yeah, that was my mom, and it also in borderline. It's one of those things where it's impossible to untangle which part is the mental illness and which part is their personality
Yeah.
and just who they are. And as a kid, certainly it was walking on eggshells and trying to navigate my mother's moods and where she was, and not easy, not easy.
No, I can only imagine. Clearly, you went through a really rough childhood, and as you said, you eventually turned to alcohol to escape a lot of those emotions or feelings and memories. Now, I was kind of curious, do you feel like you turned to alcohol because it was kind of the same crutch that your mother was using? Or, do you think that if another substance would have been around, that you would have become just as addicted to that, say, heroin or cocaine or
Mm.
whatever?
Sure. That's a great question. I had always convinced myself that I could be a sophisticated drinker, not like my mom.
Yeah.
My mom was a binge drinker. If it was in the house, she drank it until it was gone. And, so I deemed myself a fancy drinker. I could drink martinis or Manhattans,
Yeah.
and I really was convinced that I was not like her. But certainly, later as my addiction and my alcoholism got worse, I certainly discovered that washing down an Ativan with a shot of vodka had a much better effect. So I was heading in that direction, and very grateful that that didn't happen any worse than it did.
Yeah, sort of like a cross substance addiction kind of thing,
Yes,
multiple things going on.
sure,
And that can be really dangerous, benzos and alcohol.
yes. But you ignore all those warning signs while you're doing it. I used to laugh off those effects and
Yeah.
the concerns, and it's just amazing what the disease and what addiction can, how it can just totally shift things around in your thinking.
You're exactly right. And when in my younger years, I mean, I would see those warnings on the pill bottles, do not mix with alcohol, and I would see that as a sign that said, yeah, I'm going to do that and get really fucked up.
That's exactly right. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, some of the things we do, it's amazing.
Yeah.
So how long did the alcohol abuse go on for you?
I didn't get really drunk for the first time until I was about 19.
Yeah.
And I didn't like the effects. And then I moved to New York City and I went to college, and I just assumed that my drinking was normal college drinking. I never looked at it as a problem. And it wasn't until I started really dealing with my childhood and having flashbacks and dealing with memory that I started to use alcohol as a numbing agent. And so I would say in my mid 30s, it really started to reach the height, and it was medicine to me. I mean, it really was.
Yeah. Yeah. I can totally relate. I feel like as addicts, a lot of us, we self-medicate that way,
Absolutely.
in an effort to get away from whatever it is in our life that we're trying to get away from.
Yes, exactly.
Now, you do touch on it in the book early on, but with the abuse that was going on in your family, was there a kind of a precise moment that you kind of had like an epiphany or a realization that something was terribly wrong with what was going on?
Yeah, that is something that I still look at. I think
Yeah.
I'm always going to look back to that younger version of myself and look at it and say, what instincts did I have that I knew something was very, very wrong from a young age? And I lived in this house where, my sister and my parents sort of like existed in this other bubble that made me feel like the crazy one. And that was a real challenge. But yeah, the first time that I actually told a teacher in second grade that things at home were really bad.
Yeah.
The teacher did the right thing. She called my mother. She expressed her concern. And of course, that night it was a family meeting about how I was never to talk about anything that happened in our house
Yeah.
to anyone ever. And it was this code of silence that we lived on. And along with that came that sort of grooming of, we love you. You don't need anyone else except mom and dad. We are here for you. And you're lucky to have parents that love you so much. And that was the message. So, if I thought for a second as a kid something's very wrong here, I certainly learned to not share that out loud.
Yeah, and I don't think that that's really an uncommon kind of
No.
situation, especially for younger kids. I mean, you look up to mom and dad; they are these almost godlike figures, as a
Right.
child, and what they say is what is right.
Yes.
And as a kid, there's I mean, it's not like you know exactly what to do or what is the correct procedure for reporting this stuff or even talking about it. It's not
That's right.
easy, period.
No. No.
Now, you said something about this just at the beginning of our conversation about, writing the book was kind of therapeutic for you. And, whenever I tell my story, it feels like a big weight has been lifted off my chest. Not only that, but it helps to keep me vigilant
Yes.
against, future temptation and stuff like that. And I'm kind of wondering if, through writing this book, did you have sort of the same kind of
Mm.
feelings there?
I'll be honest and tell you that the actual writing of the book, when I was first doing the first draft and sort of formulating it into a book, it was those moments in that time period of my life. It was not cathartic at all to write because I was reliving something so horrible that I felt to really dive into what I had to say, I really had to re-experience it. And the childhood was one thing that was hard enough. But to then talk about my years of using alcohol and my addiction, it was really hard to go there without feeling a temptation to pick it back up. So it wasn't until I really finished that, I remained sober through writing the book that I started to feel exactly what you just said. I started to feel catharsis much later after the book was finished. And I thought,
Yeah.
okay, I'm still here. I didn't relapse. I'm holding steady. And I'm about to come out and start talking about my story on a regular basis. So yes, anytime I talk about it, it does keep me grounded in my own sobriety and in my experience.
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of us do suffer from being sensitive to triggers and stuff like that.
Sure.
And a trigger it can literally be anything. I mean, even a smell. You smell a certain scent that, takes you back to a certain time or
Yes.
a song or anything like that. And a lot of people don't realize that how sensitive people can be to certain triggers.
Right.
In many ways, after reading the book myself, it seems like as a child you were definitely kind of caught up in like the perfect storm, so to speak. In a
Yes.
lot of situations, when a child is abused, it's by one family member, but you kind of had like a double whammy. You had it coming from both sides. You had the extreme abuse and emotional abuse and manipulation from your mother, kind of coupled with the more sexual abuse from your father. Do you feel like you can ever forgive them for what happened during your childhood?
I do. I forgiveness is a funny word, right? I
Yeah.
mean, the forgiveness that I found was really for me, forgiving, letting go of the shame and the guilt and all of the things that I carried that weren't rightfully mine to begin with. And in terms of my actual parents, I very much came to a place of peace with each of them very differently. I held on to a lot of rage for a long time for my father, and my mother. My mother is so complex, and she's my mom, and it's been a tough journey for me. But I think part of the forgiveness is acknowledging the fact that my life is so much better without them in it, and that goes against what society tells us. So one of the most powerful tools I was able to give myself was to end my relationship with my parents.
Yeah, exactly. Speaking of society, in our society, and I've seen this myself, sexual abuse, especially from parents, it's kind of scrutinized or looked at as shameful, and there's a certain stigma surrounding it. I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts about what we could do in society to kind of create a more welcoming place for victims and survivors of sexual abuse to come forward and tell their stories?
I'd like to say that we're seeing a shift right now in our society and in the world and culture right now. I mean, there's been dramatic changes that have happened in certain movements, but truthfully, I think that the majority, we still tend to blame the victim.
Yeah.
And that's a pattern that has been around for so long that really has to change. And I'm optimistic that it's going to slowly start to happen as more survivors speak out. I personally believe that, by sharing our stories and our vulnerabilities, that's how we start to heal. And I think that the safer someone feels, or if someone else shares their story and somebody, feels comfortable to say a little bit about themselves, I think that gains momentum, and that's one of the best ways that we can combat the shame and the stigma that's on this.
Definitely.
I mean, it still infuriates me that if you hear a story of a rape, one of the automatic questions that people go to still is, what was she wearing?
Yeah.
And it makes me so insane that's the fallback. So hopefully that's starting to shift. I hope it is.
Yeah, and I've witnessed that. The what was she wearing? Oh, she was dressed in a scantily clad kind of
right.
clothing, and she was asking for it, or stuff like that. That's so ridiculous, man.
Yes, exactly.
Just like you, it pisses me off. It does.
Yes,
it's unreal.
Yeah, and I went through my own thing. I went through a period where, in the beginning, where I really thought, well, did I encourage my father? Was I, and it took me a long time to understand just how young I was and how defenseless I was.
Exactly.
But the automatic thinking as an adult was, well, how did I encourage this? How is it my fault? And it just wasn't.
No, definitely not, Larry. It's difficult to talk about these things, but I had a guest on a couple of weeks ago, and he made a really great point. He said, the moment that it stops hurting when I talk about this, that's probably the moment that it's no longer therapeutic for me to talk about it.
Right.
And I really agree with him. It's
I totally do as well. That's a great point.
I think it's good for us to talk about these sort of things, and definitely in a public manner. Whether it's writing a book or doing a podcast or both.
Right.
Just getting it out there can help. You have no idea how many people you're going to reach and how many people you're going to help by doing this.
Thank you. When I was really struggling of whether or not to publish Breaking the Rules, it was my therapist that said to me, do you wish that this was the kind of book that you had when you were first starting out on your journey of recovery? And when I answered yes, she said, that's all the answer you need. Yeah,
that's a really good point.
Yeah.
Now, as far as the book goes, what are your hopes for the book? What do you hope that people are going to take away from it?
As you know, since you read it, I went to some delicate areas in sharing my experience and how it affected me, and I think I questioned myself. I had some real moments of checking in and saying, am I putting myself out on the line too much? Am I allowing myself to be too vulnerable? And truthfully, in my own experience, what I've learned is that it's in those moments that other people truly relate. So my hope is that if someone reads the book and they something resonates, or they can relate to something, if they can feel a little more normal, less crazy, that they can say, okay, this happened to me too. I acted out this way too. And this guy has moved on with his life. He didn't succumb to suicide. He didn't, he's sober, whatever it is. I only hope that the book can maybe give someone some sense of hope somewhere.
Yeah, definitely. And, it's interesting because you just said that, am I the crazy one? But, it was, honestly, it was the parents in your situation that had some issues with sanity, it seems like, and through dealing with that, especially as a child, it definitely has an effect on us. And it's kind of strange. I mean, we question our own sanity after we've been around these people for so long,
That's right.
But going back to the alcohol addiction,
sure.
Many alcoholics and addicts in general, we all share the same kind of, we use in an effort to escape feelings and emotions and stuff like that. What is your advice for anybody who's listening that might be struggling with any sort of addiction?
My advice for anybody struggling with addiction is to really, if you're not in therapy, I'm a big proponent of therapy. I encourage it because I think it's a great way to start the unfolding or the untangling process for anyone. But the other thing I can say is to not remain isolated, to reach out to someone. Look into your resources locally, reach out to a friend, confide in someone, and put yourself out there a little bit on the line and talk about what you're experiencing in terms of addiction. Because I guarantee if you talk enough, somebody's going to relate and somebody's going to help guide you to the right place.
Exactly. There are tons of resources out there, and for a long time I didn't get help with my own addiction problems simply
Mhm.
because I thought it was really difficult to find the help. And
Yes.
in a rural area that I lived in, it was kind of tricky to find, like opioid replacement programs and stuff like that. But as far as counseling and therapy goes, that stuff is everywhere.
Right. Yeah, and the other thing is, and you know this, it's like we sit in silence in our addiction, and it just perpetuates, and you really feel alone, and it just feeds the addiction even further.
Yes, it snowballs out of control. I mean,
Yes.
once that ball gets rolling, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger until, you reach a breaking point or you hit rock bottom.
Right.
Now, in therapy, were you ever diagnosed with like post-traumatic stress disorder from all of this or anything like that?
It's funny. I yes, but my therapist knew me well enough to know that I was any sort of diagnosis or any sort of term, or
Yeah.
I really, I shied away from completely. I repelled it. I was just repulsed by the whole idea because in my mind back then, I looked at it as weakness. I thought, if you're going to give me a diagnosis, it means there's something wrong, that I'm weak in some way. And it took me a long time to really understand PTSD and complex trauma, and to say, okay, and just let my guard down, let my shoulders drop, and say, all right, yes, this makes sense, and yes, I have PTSD. It comes out sometimes still, and but we find our way to stay grounded.
Yes. Yes, we do. I think with post-traumatic stress disorder, there's kind of different levels or different types of it even. For instance, a few years ago on the farm where I work, there was an accident with my father, and I caused the accident, and it resulted in him losing a couple of his fingers, and
Mm,
I've been really close to my dad for forever. We play music
yes,
in a band together, and we have a really good relationship. So it was really difficult for me to kind of deal with that stuff. But I feel like it would have been a different type of post-traumatic stress had it been abuse that I received from my
sure,
father.
yes, it's a great way to look at it. One of the things that comes up for me is like, when I hear kids screaming or crying out in public, I have to tell you, my entire body tenses because I immediately go to this place of they're in trouble.
Yeah.
They need help. And there have been some very, very challenging times for me where I have not been convinced that a child has not been in danger, even when I can see them. So, that's some of the ways, and some of the things that come up for me now, at 45 years old, that it all still lives with me. I have this hypervigilance that kicks in, and which can make my chest tighten and my anxiety rise, and I want to be sure that kids are safe.
Exactly. I think, we kind of develop uh, almost like muscle memory,
Yes,
certain reactions to certain things, and you could even call those triggers or whatever, but
sure.
and we react a certain way in a typical way based on, our past and how we were raised, what we dealt with during our childhood, and these sort of things. And it's like an actual memory, but it's not in your brain. It's like almost like a central nervous system memory
Right.
system going on.
You talked about smells earlier being
Yeah.
one of them. I got thrown. I had to be spend some time in a hospital visiting a friend in the fall, and without thinking, I used hand sanitizer,
Yeah.
and I have to tell you, a few minutes after, I smell it on my hands, and it's like instant, like start to salivate.
Yep.
I started immediately, got tripped up, and I thought, boy, wouldn't this smells like alcohol.
Exactly.
This is alcohol. This
Yeah.
smells like alcohol, and wouldn't a gin make this all feel much better?
Yeah.
And it's wild to me when those moments come up and you realize how potent addiction is.
Now, when those moments do come up, Larry, what is your best strategy for dealing with them?
I usually remove myself from the situation as fast as I can. I usually take a walk, or I'll pace. I'm a pacer. I'll pace,
Yeah.
and then I usually reach out to a fellow addict, somebody who gets it, and just say, I need to check in. I need to check in. Quick text. This just happened. Through me. I think I'll eat some candy or whatever it
Yep.
is.
Yep.
Those are my sort of two go-to ways to deal in the moment.
For sure. And I think that's a really good way of going about it. I think that anybody who's recovering from addiction should kind of aim to develop a strategy for when these types of triggers happen and what we're going to do in the situation should it happen. Because it may never happen. You may never encounter a trigger, but you should always be ready just in case you do,
That's right.
Always have to keep a constant guard up almost.
Yes.
Now, where you have a website as well, Larry, don't you?
Yes, it's breakingtheruhls.com, and my last name is Ruhls.
Yes.
Yes. And and I'm trying to update it with resources for people, ways to reach out if somebody needs a recommendation to something. If there's something that I can offer, I'm happy to do it.
Awesome. Well, I think that's probably going to wrap it up right here, Larry. I really appreciate you coming on the show, and I'm sure that our listeners do too.
Can't thank you enough for having me. Really, truly. Thank you.
Just so we all know, where exactly can we find your book?
On the website, I list a few resources, but it is on Amazon.
Yeah.
So that's probably the fastest and what people refer to most.
All right. Sounds great. Well, be sure and go out and check out that book because, like I said, it's a real page turner. I could not put it down. I think I blew through it in about 3 or 4 days. I mean, your writing is fantastic, Larry, and you have just a good way of putting it all out there. It's really clear,
so
really concise, really easy to read. I'm the type of reader who I imagine the story in my mind as I'm reading it, visually. And I found that with your book, it was really, really easy to do that.
Wow, thank you.
No problem.
That's like the best compliment.
I appreciate you having an interest in coming on the podcast today. It means an awful lot to me. It really does.
Anytime.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Larry.
Thanks. Have a great day.
Well, there you have it. I would like to once again thank Larry for taking some time to come on the show and share his story. And if you are someone who is struggling with addiction or abuse of any sort, be sure to reach out and find the help that you not only need but deserve. Oftentimes, help is easier to find than we sometimes realize. Yes, it can be difficult to take that first step towards recovery, but once you do it, I promise you that it will be well worth it. Like I said, if you are interested in reading Larry's book, Breaking the Ruhls, be sure to visit his website at www.breakingtheruhls.com. And again, that's rules spelled Ruhls. You can also find the book by searching for it on Amazon. And as always, I want to thank you all so much for listening to the show. And remember, never quit quitting.
Then you smashed your only car. You aren't what you are really. You missed it by so damn far. Your head feels like it's in a blender, and you hate to see the dawn. Your stomach says return to sender after the buzz is gone. And Sundays you prayed to Uncle John. You poisoned yourself last night. Mary slapped your friend Tom. You got in a hell of a fight. Monday comes and it's back to work. The week seems so damn long. The weekend's past, you're still a jerk after the buzz is gone.